Welcome to the Diversity Celebration Series, recognizing Mental Health Awareness Month. Our program will begin in 2 minutes, so please make yourself comfortable. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for the final Diversity Celebration Series event in the 2020-2021 academic year, highlighting National Mental Health Month, presented by the College of Health Sciences and Human Services at CSU Monterey Bay. Before we begin our program, we would like to review some housekeeping items with you. Tonight's program will be streaming on Facebook and YouTube Live. Throughout the program this evening, you will have the ability to submit questions for the speaker. If you are watching on YouTube Live, please submit questions in the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are joining us on Facebook, use the comment bar to submit questions for this event. You may submit questions at any time during the webinar, and they will be answered live in the second portion of our program. Closed captioning is being provided by Verbit. If you need captioning accommodations, the link will be posted in the YouTube and Facebook chats momentarily. Follow the link to open the captions in a separate browser window. If you need assistance during this event, please email specialevents@csumb.edu. One of our team members is monitoring this email and will respond to assist you. At this time, please welcome Dr. Alan M. Hoffman, Interim Dean of the College of Health Sciences and Human Services at CSU Monterey Bay.
Okay. Well, to all those attending this meeting, greetings and welcome. And here we go. I want to acknowledge and greet everybody who's joining this conference from throughout California, the nation, and globally. I want to welcome you to this very important meeting. I'm Alan Hoffman. I am very honored to be serving as the interim dean of the College of Health Sciences and Human Services. Like many events, I want to acknowledge and thank many of the people that helped this event take place. They helped structure it, they helped plan it, and frankly, they're helping to implement it. This had a very unique planning committee. It was composed of a group of faculty and staff. Committee members included Daramola Cabral, Department of Health and Human Services and Public Policy, Dr. Maria Garola, Department Chair of Social Work. I'll introduce these two individuals a little bit later. They'll be serving as discussants and panelists during this particular meeting. I also want to acknowledge staff members Kat McHenry, Dan Wilson, and Crescenda Zaccaro for not only serving on the committee, but really helping to get this implemented. The technical team under the leadership of Aaron Bryant, the team includes Sydney Kalman, Marlena Rose, Joey Pendergrass. They particularly should be thanked for really helping with all the technical assistance and guidance in this particular program. Very importantly, I also want to acknowledge the sponsors. They're a local group of generous donors that helped underwrite this event. They are Dignity Health, Doctors on Duty, Salinas Memorial Hospital, and Natividad Medical Center. They're also committed to the not only helping, but they're committed to the notion of diversity and inclusion and have been very generous in helping us. I just want to take a couple of seconds to talk a little bit about the College of Health Sciences. And we were established in 2014, and we have 5 degree programs. 3 of them are nationally accredited. Undergraduate degrees in the programs in a Bachelor of Arts in Collaborative Health and Human Services, a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology, Bachelor of Science in Nursing, Master's degree in Social Work, and a Master's degree in Physician Assistant Education. So part of the mission of the College of Health Sciences is really strengthening the quality of life of diverse communities whom we live, work, and serve through not only the education we provide, but frankly, in the services and the outreach that we do. So as a College of Health Sciences and Human Services, the college is dedicated to the notion of how can we effectively change lives and make people's lives better. Not only the students we serve, but how we reach into the community. We take the notion of diversity and inclusion seriously, and the notion of social justice is deeply embedded within the fabric and the framework of who the College of Health Science is and what we do. You know, there's an old saying, what you do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you're saying. And in many ways, this conference is an example of that not only are we committed to making the lives of people better, but to helping folks begin to understand some of the social, political, and issues that might exist. This month's series, or this series, really deals with celebrating Mental Health Awareness Month. And as I mentioned, that part of our commitment is the idea that we believe that mental health should be one of the key areas to help people live a better life. 20% of adults experience some type of mental illness each year in America, and 1 in 6 people in the United States age 16 through 17 experience a mental health disorder. 50% of all people will experience some type of mental health issue sometime within their life, and that's one of the interesting statistics. And yet, as we talk about mental health, it's been one of the areas that are not well covered by insurance programs and not well understood by many people. And that brings us to why we brought our speaker in. So it's my pleasure to introduce the two panel moderators and discussants, and they will move forward in the program. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daramola Cabral. Dr. Cabral serves as a professor of public health and population health sciences in the Department of Health and Human Services and Public Policy at California State University. She earned her Doctor of Public Health and Epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley, and she holds a Master of Public Health in Maternal and Child Health, also from the University of California at Berkeley. She holds a bachelor's degree in medical science and physician assistant from Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Cabral has been not only a researcher, a faculty member, but she's also practiced as a physician assistant in Alameda County, California. Dr. Cabral has served as a director of HIV prevention and epidemiology in the County of Alameda and a cancer control officer and epidemiologist in the City and County of San Francisco. In addition to her professorship at California State University, Monterey Bay, she has served as a professor at Empire State College and John F. Kennedy University. She's been instrumental in developing allied health programs, public health programs, and physician assistants. Her current research focuses on the causes that perpetuate inequalities in cancer risks and disparities. She is a gifted researcher, health professional, provider, and scholar. It's also my pleasure to introduce our other panelist and discussant, Dr. Maria Garola. Dr. Garola serves as a professor in the Department of Social Work at California State University, Monterey Bay. She holds a PhD in social work from Arizona State University, and she also works in the Community Health Engagement Center that provides case management and outreach to the people in need for housing in Monterey County. Previous to coming to Cal State Monterey Bay, she was a professor at New Mexico State University, where she served as the Bachelor of Science in Social Work and the Master of Science in Social Work coordinator. Her research interests span migration policy, the separation of families by international borders, and the influence of global health on family. She's published her research both in social work venues as well as in other publications. She's been instrumental in the work of violence against women, interpersonal violence, immigration, employer sanctions, and mental health of Latino children. Both of these folks are very gifted scholars, researchers, and collaborators on this event. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Garola, who will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for the introduction. The College of Health, can you hear me? Hello? There I am. Thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for introducing me. The College of Health and Science and Human Services welcome everyone and Ms. Esmé Weijun Wang to our diversity celebration series on perspectives on managing mental health and wellness. Since 1949, Mental Health America has observed May reaching everyone about the importance of knowing about mental health. Every year as a country, we raise awareness and fight stigma, provide support, educate others, and advocate for policies and services to support people with mental illness and their families. Now, more than ever, we need to stay connected. There is no reason for anyone to feel alone, yet the COVID-19 pandemic has had a great impact on the mental health of all of us. It is essential to think about stigma and how critical it is to reduce stigma for everyone to be able to seek help. The National Alliance on Mental Illness also adds to this awareness with the phrase, "You are not alone." We follow our college mission of helping people live longer, happier, and healthier lives by preparing professionals to serve our local communities with our undergrad and graduate programs, including collaborative health and human services, kinesiology, nursing, social work, and physician assistant. Again, the College of Health and Science and Human Services at CSUMB is thrilled to welcome Ms. Esmé Weijun Wang. She's a best-selling essayist and novelist and an author of the Collected Schizophrenias to celebrate National Mental Health Awareness. Ms. Wang will be reflecting on her experiences living with schizoaffective disorder and a late-stage Lyme disease diagnosis in today's world and how to persevere to complex mental and physical health challenges. The Collected Schizophrenias is not just for her fellow members of the Collected Schizophrenias, but to those who wish to understand it as well. Opening with the journey towards her diagnosis of a schizoaffective disorder, Ms. Wang discusses the medical community's own disagreement about labels and procedures for diagnosing those with mental illness. In essays that range from using fashion to present as high functioning to the depths of a rare form of psychosis, and from the failures of the higher education system to support students with mental illness, to the complexity of having other diagnoses such as PTSD and Lyme disease, Ms. Wang's critical eye as a former lab researcher at Stanford allowed her to balance research with personal narrative. An essay collection of undeniable power, the Collected Schizophrenias reveals misconceptions and provides insight into conditions long misunderstood. As a daughter of Taiwanese parents, her experiences relate to many of our community in the Salinas Valley and the stigma of mental illness with our families, particularly in a community where talking about this is not appropriate and is to stay within the family. Ms. Wang was born in the Midwest and lives in San Francisco and can be found at esmewang.com and on Twitter at esmewang. She encourages everyone every morning for another day from her Twitter account, saying, "ISAP, let's go." Welcome, Ms. Wang.
Hello, thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. I'm so excited to be with you all today. I'm honored to be brought here by CSU Monterey Bay, especially during May, which is such an important month in which to talk about mental health. It is Mental Health Awareness Month, as I am sure you are all aware. And today I'm going to be sharing some stories, talk about some big ideas, and hopefully open our minds to learning about one another's minds. I'm going to talk about stigma, different forms of stigma, and how toxic it can be, as well as how embedded it is in our culture, as well as cultures around the world. I'll discuss the fight against stigma and ways that encouraging self-advocacy and resilience can help to soften other difficulties that go along with a mental health diagnosis. Finally, I'll talk about hopes and dreams and how the jobs of mental health professionals, should you be or decide to go into those professions, are to carry other people's hopes and dreams when they can't do them themselves. Before I start, though, I'd like to paint a picture of what it might look like to be a person living with a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. Me, who sees themselves as identifying very much with their diagnosis, from an essay called Yale Will Not Save You. I'm still trying to figure out what okay is, particularly whether there exists a normal version of myself beneath a disorder, in the way a person with cancer is a healthy person first and foremost. In the language of cancer, people describe a thing that invades them so that they can then battle the cancer. No one ever says that a person is cancer or that they have become cancer, but they do say that a person is manic depressive or schizophrenic once those illnesses have taken hold. In my peer education courses, I was taught to say that I am a person with schizoaffective disorder. Person first language suggests that there is a person in there without the delusions and the rambling and the catatonia. But what if there isn't? What happens if I see my disordered mind as a fundamental part of who I am? It has, in fact, shaped the way I experience my life. Should the question be a matter of percentages of my lifetime, I've spent enough of this lifetime with schizoaffective disorder to see it as a dominant force. And if it's true that I think, therefore I am, perhaps the fact that my thoughts have been so heavily modeled with confusion means that those confused thoughts make up the gestalt of myself. This is why I use the word schizophrenic, though many mental health advocates don't. My friends with anxiety disorders, for example, tend to speak of anxiety as a component of their personality. Laura Turner writes in her essay, "How do you inherit anxiety?" It is from Verna Lee Boatwright Berg that I inherited my long face, my quick hands, my fear that someday soon I will do something wrong and the world will come to a sharp end. In their minds, there's no tabula rasa overlaid by a transparency of hypochondria, generalized anxiety disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder. Such thoughts are hardwired into their minds with no self that can be untangled from the pathology they experience. Another friend's obsessive compulsive disorder has calmed significantly since she began taking Prozac, but she continues to be most comfortable when things are tidy, even though her tidiness is no longer disruptive. She still washes her hands more than any other friend I know. There might be something comforting about the notion that there is, deep down, an impeccable self without disorder, and that if I try hard enough, I might be able to reach that unblemished self. But there may be no impeccable self to reach, and if I continue to struggle toward one, I might go mad in the pursuit. I share this because I want to start off with the idea that people like me, that people with the mental health issues, have all kinds of different ideas about how we might relate to our mental health issues. At different times in my life, I've identified more or less with my diagnosis, which impacts my life differently depending on how much stigma I'm facing in the moment. I've been living and working in the worlds of mental health and illness for a while now. I've often been asked, so what is it like to disclose to people that you've been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder? And to be honest, it used to be a lot harder before I published a book that is, in large part, about my life with a psychotic disorder. The information often comes before people meet me. I used to get hired at jobs and leave them without ever disclosing to any of my coworkers that I was living with hallucinations or delusions. That time in my life, though, was stressful. It was stressful because I didn't know when, if ever, would be the appropriate time to come out about having a serious mental health diagnosis in my personal life, in my work life, in my school life. I remember meeting a classmate named Anna, and her then boyfriend and my now husband were going on a double date. They were going to go see Superman, and we were going to go see The Devil Wears Prada, talk about the gender binary. And so Superman was starting about half an hour before The Devil Wears Prada. So Anna and I went to a coffee shop nearby and, just had some coffee, chatted as the friends that we were starting to be. I was extraordinarily nervous, though. My diagnosis at the time was bipolar disorder, and I felt that we were at that early point in the friendship where I needed to tell her that I had that diagnosis. So I just blurted it out. I need to tell you something, I said with exactly that amount of chill. I have bipolar disorder. Oh, she said. Anna was and is a very kind person, and we are still friends over 13 years later. She said, I have an anxiety disorder. And it was such a relief. I remember kind of fist pumping in my head, kind of going, yes. And later, I would learn so much more about what Anna was dealing with, including generalized anxiety disorder and hypochondria. And she would see me through inpatient hospitalization and some of the worst of my psychotic symptoms. Anna is one of the people that has provided me with support rather than stigma. But this has not always been the case. We live in a society that frequently throws around words casually like psycho and crazy and schizo. That's one small thing we can do, to not say crazy when what we mean is ridiculous. We can try to catch our verbal habits in order to prevent ourselves from reinforcing the fact that pop culture portrays mental illness as something to fear rather than something that can happen to people that we love or even to ourselves, something from our worst nightmares, and certainly not something that we can thrive and live with. And we can catch when other people do the same thing. It's hard to speak up when someone else is doing the talking, but it's worth it to the community at large if you can say, oh, do you mean that it's ridiculous? Not crazy? I thank you in advance for doing this. Before the Collected Schizophrenias came out, but while I was writing it, I would notice stigma coming regarding my diagnosis from all kinds of people, absolutely well-meaning people. At a writer's residency, no one knew about my diagnosis until one morning when we were going around in a circle, reading our work out loud to one another. I read from an essay about the metaphor of demonic possession and schizophrenia, which also drew from my own experiences of psychosis and inpatient hospitalization. And after everyone had finished reading, one of the other members of the residency came up to me and said, "It's so amazing that you're sick that way, because you could never tell. You don't have those tics and things." At a fundraising party for my publisher, a donor came up to me and said, "It's so good to meet you. You're so eloquent for someone with such a terrible diagnosis." And every time someone said something like this to me, I would have absolutely no idea of what to say. Was there anything polite that I could say in response? I would have no idea, particularly if this person was to remain in my life, if they would go on to see me differently. It always felt like a roll of the dice, because what was there to say in the face of the history of stigma, particularly about schizophrenia and its related disorders? On the other hand, spending time around me was one good way to decrease stigma, because prejudice tends to die in proximity. I should be glad that nobody thinks that I'm a potential murderer, because that's one of the few times I hear about schizophrenia. It's in the news when someone commits a terrible act of violence, and then it turns out that they have some kind of mental illness. Stigma comes from American culture, Western culture, but it's also carried over from immigrant cultures, which I believe many of you will be able to identify with. My parents came from Taiwan in the early 80s, and when my high school counselor finally told me that my depression was severe enough that I would need to see a psychiatrist, I told my mother, and my mother yelled at me. "How could you do this?" she said. "How could you do this when we fed you and clothed you and when you have a roof over your head?" I cried and cried. I went to school and I hid in the art room crying, and I didn't actually see a psychiatrist until that school counselor summoned my mother to the school and told her that if I didn't see a psychiatrist, I could really end up hurting myself. And this, my mother understood. So when my mother took me to see a psychiatrist who was a white man and who kept the shades pulled, he asked her if there was a history of mental illness in our family, which is a very common question at your first psychiatrist visit. Did we, he asked, have any relatives who had any kind of mental illness? No, my mother said. And as far as I knew, that was the truth. Later, I would learn that this was not true. My great aunt, my mother's aunt, had died in a mental institution. Her cousin had killed himself, and my mother had experienced depression and anxiety and panic attacks herself. But when I asked my mom why she hadn't said anything about this to the doctor, she said in Chinese, 我们不讲这种东西. We don't talk about these things. In other words, it was none of his business, even if he was a psychiatrist. I learned that she'd been diagnosed with panic disorder, among other things, but refused to take the medication that she'd been prescribed. She'd been so depressed after giving birth to me that she nearly killed me and then herself. But all of this, she said, was none of his business. Cultural stigma is a big part of most cultural groups, which is one reason that mental health professionals who are members of an in-group can be so helpful. In the end, back when I was a teenager, I saw a Chinese American psychiatrist long-term, and I'm sure that having a psychiatrist who could communicate with my parents directly in a language that they were familiar with was important to my entry into the mental health world. The website Therapy for Black Girls, for example, has a directory of mental health professionals who provide services for Black women and girls. Similarly, the website Therapy for Latinx provides a directory for Latinx therapists all over the country. Before I came out publicly about my diagnosis, first of bipolar disorder and then schizoaffective disorder bipolar type, I worked at the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Lab in the psychology department at Stanford University, as well as the bipolar lab in the psychiatry department. It was around this time that I first began to experience signs of psychosis. My first experience of psychosis occurred when I was in the dorm showers. I heard a voice say very clearly, "I hate you." I knew that I was alone in the bathroom, and yet this voice was speaking directly into my ear. I wondered if it was coming out of the drain or the pipes somehow, but when I realized that it wasn't possible, I finished my shower and went back into my room in a daze. I told my roommate what had just happened, and she said, "You're crazy," which was not what I needed or wanted to hear just then. She since apologized for that response, but it was really hard to feel alone with that experience. The hallucinations started to come more frequently. I started to see corpses in the passenger seats of cars and demonic shadows flying at my head, which would cause me to dodge and duck rather dramatically. It was always the things that caused me to have a physical response that scared me the most, because the other things I could just pretend to not see. I could see a corpse in the car and just go, la-di-da, I will ignore that. But I would jump when a hallucination of a giant hole would open up in front of me. My goal during these times was to conceal what was happening to me as much as possible. Excuse me. Meanwhile, I would go to work and interview people who would tell me stories about having manic episodes that, for example, would cause them to climb onto the roofs of their homes so that they could communicate with UFOs. And I kept telling myself, that's not me, that's not me. But it also very much was me. We were very much the same, except I was getting paid to interview them, and they didn't know that I had a diagnosis. I was, in effect, living a double life. I didn't tell any of my coworkers about what I was experiencing because some of them would talk about our research subjects with a certain amount of condescension and even disrespect. I was afraid that they would think of me differently. I was afraid that they wouldn't trust me with the very important work that we were doing. Life would have been easier, I think, if I'd opened up back then. One of the most important things for me then and now regarding living with a mental health diagnosis involves my second major point, figuring out what I needed most to develop and maintain resilience, and then using self-advocacy to ask for it. Because people sometimes make assumptions about what other people need, especially when it comes to mental illness. For example, if someone is a barista and they disclose to their manager that they're dealing with mental health symptoms, their manager might assume that they need fewer hours or not interact with customers. Maybe they should be put in the back. But maybe that might be the wrong thing exactly. Maybe they need more hours. Maybe they need to interact more with customers. Learning to self-advocate is essential because we need to figure out what we need first, and then we need to figure out how to claim what we need and make that happen. I've spoken earlier about the importance of language. One of the first things I learned as a mental health advocate was to use person-first language. So person with schizophrenia instead of schizophrenic, or person with depression instead of depressive. Once I became more involved with the disability rights community, however, I realized, just like with all communities, that not everyone has the same opinion. Some people identify strongly with their diagnosis and don't like person-first language. In fact, person-first language really bothers some people, which is why self-advocacy is a great skill. You can tell people what kind of language they prefer. You can strengthen that self-advocacy muscle because it's often not easy to advocate for ourselves. Self-advocacy, it's important and it's difficult. We are told not to trust our own minds, that we are lesser people, and that our opinions don't matter. It takes a lot to battle the force of all of those insistent inner and outer critics. It takes a lot of practice to build a habit of asking for what we need. There's a saying that people associate with me: keep going, you're doing great. I even had it put on a mug. It seems extremely corny, I know, but it's something that means a lot to me. It means a lot to me because for so many people, keeping going is no small thing. I've taken one overdose and been hospitalized as an inpatient 3 times. If you're alive and you're proverbially putting one foot in front of the other, I think you're doing great. Resilience matters. Support matters because you never know what will happen next. The writer Nicole Cliff once asked on Twitter, "What is the most optimistic thing you believe?" Here are a few of the answers. I kind of unironically believe in the idea of tomorrow being another day. In hard times, there is usually something good on the horizon. And my personal favorite, I think the best fries I'll ever eat are still in my future. All of these, even the one about the fries, is about persisting, even in hard times, which is something that non-mental health professionals have reminded me of in my darkest hours. In 2013, I had been in a psychotic episode for 10 months, and I was about to quit my full-time job because of it. I went to see my psychiatrist, and she told me that we had tried every single antipsychotic medication on the market. And because of that, she told me that it seemed like I had a treatment-resistant form of schizoaffective disorder. She said that it seemed incredibly unlikely that I would ever be anything close to normal again. And I left her office sobbing, really, truly sobbing and hopeless. There are times in life when we're terrified because the forecast for the future seems unbelievably bleak. If it were meteorological, it would say natural disaster. I say there are because I think these times are unavoidable. As much as we would like to think that we could avoid them, these times we wonder how we will ever get through, if we're ever going to make it. And as I was about to enter the doorway for the elevators, full of doom and gloom and crying, the security guard stopped me. And I feel like As a security guard for a big HMO, and particularly for the psychiatry department, it's probably not that unusual to see someone crying. But he stopped me and he asked, "Are you okay? What happened?" And I told him a short version of what had happened. "Well," he said, and he was a very big guy, "the doctors don't know everything. Are you a writer?" I was surprised by that because how could he know that I was a writer? I said, "Yes." "Go home," he said, "and write about it." 6 years later, the Collected Schizophrenias debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. But I couldn't have imagined that at that time, especially on that day. All I could do was to keep going, which is its own kind of resilience. I'm so grateful to my psychiatrists. I'm so grateful to my therapist, and I'm so grateful for everyone who has helped me to keep going, including that security guard who I gave a thank you card to the next time I saw him, and then I never saw him again. So finally, I will say this. One of your biggest jobs, especially if you eventually work with people or do work with people who have mental health issues, is to help them keep going. If at all possible, on top of that, to keep dreaming too. And when they can't do that, for you to help to keep dreaming for them. I went to give a couple of talks at the Chinatown Mental Health Clinic a few years ago. And the first talk was fine. It was to the group of people diagnosed with schizophrenia who had been meeting for about a decade. And they were Chinese and Chinese American people, and I could really identify with all of these things. I felt very comfortable in front of them. They were my people, so to speak. But the second meeting was in front of the clinicians, downstairs in a different room. It felt different. The room was very bright, and the clinicians started to wander in, men and women in business casual who found seats and stared, including one man who actually sat in the back of the room and glowered at me. He made me nervous, but it was true that all of them, even the friendly seeming ones, made me nervous. So I tried to sound confident. I didn't want to seem like the crazy person in front of the room giving a talk, even though I was definitely the crazy person in front of the room giving a talk. I worried that they were bored. I'm pretty sure that one glowering guy actually was bored. I made sure to mention what schools I'd been to and what jobs I'd worked. And when it was over, I was so relieved, and I just wanted to slip out the back door and go home. But this one woman stopped me before I could leave. She thanked me for coming to the clinic and for giving my talk. And she said, "It's hard working with these people. At first, you have so much hope for them. And then they get sick and relapse. And then they get better. And then they get sick again. And it happens over and over until a lot of the time you lose that hope. Having you come today reminded me that it's important to keep hoping for them." I've mentioned that there's a saying that people associate with me. Keep going, you're doing great. But there's another one that people probably associate with me even more than that one, and I didn't even know until I went on my book tour. This was mentioned a little bit in my introduction, which I was not expecting, but it was a very nice surprise. So I was touring the country and even touring the world, doing events. I learned that people really appreciate the Collected Schizophrenias, but they also really appreciate, of all things, my good mornings on Twitter. By which I mean these little blessing type things that I write on a lot of mornings. Here are a few of them. Good morning. May we let ourselves soften with the pleasure of something small. May we find a granule of joy, or better yet, may we grow into our best selves and love and be loved. Eyes up. Let's go. Good morning. May we be loved. May our minds thrive. May our hearts not skitter with fear, but beat with courage. May we help others more than we harm. Eyes up. Let's go. Good morning. May we be safe. May we not hurt others and work for justice, not only in the wider world, but in our smaller circles as well. Eyes up. Let's go. And so those are a few examples of those tweets that grew to mean something to people. These good morning tweets that I didn't think much about, I just gave them every morning, but that people all over the world would mention to me as being encouraging in a world that can be so desolate feeling and frightening, especially when you're struggling with mental illness. Which brings me to this point. You can help people in ways that you may not realize are helpful. Bringing a friend dealing with depression, frozen meals, just sitting with a loved one when you know that they're struggling. I'm often asked that if I could tell people one thing when they're first diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis, what that would be. And I usually say, remember that you are still you. You are still that person who can't stand peas in their fried rice, who has a freckle on the right hand and sings like a bird. Hold on to that. And for those of you who work within systems that often reinforce the strangeness of mental illness, rather than the humanity of those who live with mental illness, remember that too, and help your clients and patients to remember that. Fight the stigma that exists toward mental illness. Cultivate resilience and self-advocacy. Carry the hopes and dreams of others and yourself. Eyes up. Let's go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esmé, for talking to us today. It is great to have you with us and really talking about how it is as a social worker working with people with mental illness. Is great to hear you, and it's great to really see how we can help our clients, how we can be there for them, how we can keep going and keep dreaming. So thank you so much. And what I want to do is just think about, and I'm sorry I haven't started my video, but I'm here now. This is the new shelter in place way of working. But again, thank you. And it is, as I was mentioning, great for us to hear you and to really understand how to work with people with mental illness. So what we're gonna do now is to really think about what you just told us. And I have been, as I knew you were gonna be coming to talk to us, I started looking at several of your presentations in other settings. And in one of your presentations, you talk about vulnerability, and you talk about Brené Brown, that she's also a social worker. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about, you talk about the concept of coming out and safety. So if you can just go back and review a little bit about that and how you advise others, as you mentioned, when you get first the news about a diagnosis, how to think about it, but also how to tell others about it, and how to feel safe, but at the same time vulnerable when you're talking to them about your diagnosis.
That's a great question. And it's a question that I'm often asked. And I think that one really important thing before I start talking about how to come out about illness or about how to tell others, I want to mention something else that Brené Brown does say when she talks about vulnerability, which is that you have to be really careful about who you're vulnerable with, because not everyone is going to be a safe person. So I often look at discussions that people have online and different kinds of advice that people get, in particular about how to disclose to, say, their boss or their manager. And honestly, it's not always safe to disclose to a higher up, especially in a work setting. You do not know if they will have some kind of stigma that you don't know about. You don't know if they're going to treat you differently. And this is the same with people that you might just close with in your personal life or in your wider social circles. As much as we would like to think that being vulnerable is always a good thing, unfortunately, stigma definitely exists, and especially exists depending on what kind of diagnosis you might have or what kind of communities you're in. So I want to give that kind of slightly more negative news first. But in terms of disclosure and letting people know about a diagnosis, I won't talk quite as much about in the workplace, because I feel like that's a really touchy subject, and it's probably very different depending on what kind of career you have or what kind of HR system your workplace has, et cetera. But what I will say is, in terms of in a social setting, often if you start to feel like your friendship, as in the case with myself and Anna that one time before we went to go see the movie, you kind of get a gut feeling a lot of the time regarding whether or not this person is a safe person to talk to. And often, even if that person doesn't know a lot about whatever diagnosis you have, they will learn a lot from being your friend or being someone who becomes close to you. I was thinking actually the first person that I saw, or the first people I saw during the pandemic outside of my partner, was this past Sunday. I saw my brother and his wife. And his wife works at a big tech company, and she has actually started a neurodiversity organization in her company. And she was telling me that the biggest thing that caused her to learn a lot more about neurodiversity and about mental health issues, et cetera, was actually getting to know me. And it was getting to know me specifically when she came to take care of me during the worst psychotic episode of my life. During that time, we had this care calendar, and people in our family or my friends could just sign up and sit with me because that was what I really needed at the time. And she came for a week, and so she came every day. And it was during those times that she learned a little bit more about what I was going through. And I think, according to her, she learned a lot. So I think it's important to remember that the person that you're disclosing to is not necessarily, you're not necessarily a pity case or a charity case. Often you are helping the other person to learn more about the world, to become more empathic towards other people. And that's a really wonderful thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know we really appreciate you being with us, and I'm going to pass it now to Dr. Cabral. We have several questions already in the queue for our audience to ask you questions.
Esmé, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'm not sure why my video is not showing.
I can see it.
A message that it won't start. Oh. I can't see myself. I don't need to be so vain, right? Let me just open the Q&A with a couple of questions, and then we're going to jump to the questions that are populating from the audience. So I wanted to provide a construct, one that looks at the individual, one that looks at the healthcare provider, and then public health overall. So the first is, even, when I was in practice as a physician assistant and I worked in public health settings and community-based clinics, and we came to know schizophrenia as a cultural bounded illness. Meaning that a difference in culture can influence how it manifests. and in Western societies tend to view schizophrenia symptoms as a medical issue, whereas Eastern societies treat it as a spiritual or supernatural phenomena. So the question is, from the perspective of the lived experience, would you provide some comments on culturally mediated perspectives on mental health in general and schizophrenia specifically?
Sure. So I probably know the most about how what I call the schizophrenias manifests in different cultures, just because of my lived experience, but also because of the research I did for my book. I remember reading this really interesting research article about India and how a lot of outcomes for people diagnosed with schizophrenia in India tended to be much more positive than in the Western world. And if I'm remembering this correctly, it had a lot to do with the fact that people were not told they had any kind of diagnosis. The community or their families would kind of come around them, and it wasn't this kind of way that we go about it here, where it's like you go to a doctor, then the doctor asks you a bunch of questions from the DSM, and then they diagnose you with something, and then they tell you you have this, and then you start to either identify with the thing or not identify with the thing, and so on. In terms of my own experience and how I feel culture has impacted it. Wait, I'm trying to, oh yeah, okay. So you were talking about Eastern kind of interpretations as a more supernatural or things of that nature. And that's actually some of the material that I start to go into toward the end of my book. In the beginning, I wanted to kind of present the reader with information that you would find like from the CDC, or like, just things that you would find in the DSM, like what exactly is schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder? What are the symptoms? Like, what are these things that we quote unquote know? Like, what does the NIMH say about the percentage of people who are diagnosed with this in the country? And then toward the end of the book, I feel like it kind of opens into a funnel, and I start to ask more questions and ask more questions about things that are quote unquote less understood. And so one of those essays is called Beyond the Hedge, and it has to do with a little bit about when I started talking to my mother about my diagnosis and these symptoms that I was experiencing. And she would say, well, there are people in Taiwan who have jobs related to these kinds of symptoms. They are fortune tellers. They give people advice. They have a very different role in society. And so I started to look more into the kind of mystical and these things that we don't that are less kind of scientific, less research-based and things like that. And so I started to, I found a spiritual mentor, and I started looking into liminal worlds and those kinds of things, which also felt important to my recovery and to my diagnosis, as well as taking medication and such. So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
I think what you're saying kind of dovetails with my second question, and I'm going to get to some of the questions that our community is asking. But when we think about treatment and culture, what are some of your insights on how a person's cultural background should influence the way clinicians think about schizophrenia and treat it and care for the individual?
Yeah, this is what I was talking about a little bit in my talk. Just for one thing, I think that having a treatment team or a community that is from a similar background is really helpful, or can be really helpful. When I went to the Chinatown Mental Health Clinic and I saw all of these Chinese and Chinese American people all diagnosed with schizophrenia who had been in this group for over a decade or about a decade. And it allowed them to form a community. It allowed them to form a community where they felt like they understood one another, that they were coming from similar backgrounds. Even the stigmas that they were dealing with from their culture were similar stigmas. And I saw it with my own eyes, and I saw that it was helpful. As I mentioned, I think that these organizations or things that people develop, like directories for therapists or psychiatrists with similar backgrounds, is very useful. I see this not only in, kind of race-based culture, but also, finding queer therapists, or finding trans therapists, or finding, any kind of treatment team that might be able to relate to one's experience in a deeper way.
Thank you. So one of our questions from the community is, what types of supports truly helped you to feel safe in your body and safe in the world again?
Yeah. That's a big question. I mean, today I was not feeling particularly safe in my body and in my mind, just because I think that often when you're living with some form of mental illness, especially one that has a lot to do with unreality, it's just something that will recur and will be a part of one's life, likely for a majority of the time. But in terms of just grounding, things that I have found grounding, I think that this seems maybe obvious, but therapy and medication have been hugely helpful to me, in terms of feeling like I have a treatment plan that I can rely on is really helpful. For example, I personally have not felt that inpatient hospitalization was super helpful for me. And so knowing that if I get to a really bad point, I have talked to people in my family and people close to me in terms of what can we do instead of inpatient hospitalization. It's not that I don't think that it might be helpful to me at some point in the future, or I might really need it at some point in the future, but what can we try instead? What are some stabilizing things in my life? And I actually created at one point a handbook that I kind of called like the care and feeding of Esmé, that just like listed all of these things that were helpful to me, because I find that when one is in a really bad place, you tend to forget what was helpful to you in the past, even on a day-to-day basis. So those are some of my thoughts on that.
Okay. And this question is coming from a new mom. She says, let's see, as a newly first-time single mom, how would you recommend, or what would you recommend, the best way to go about having to care for a baby while going through a psychotic episode?
Oh, wow. Honestly, I do not know if I am the best person to ask, because I do not have any children and I do not plan on having any children. My suggestion would probably be to find other people in a similar situation or who have gone through a similar situation. And I find that the internet can be a really great place for things like this, especially during pandemic times when we can't really see one another in person as much. And I also feel like treatment providers might also be a good source for this kind of thing. But I'm sorry, I cannot offer anything more specific from my own experience.
No, I think that's really helpful, reaching out to and making sure that she has a care team and a support system, be it family, friends, or, her community, reaching to her broader community. Let's see, there's another question that's linked to support team. She says that you mentioned a support team. Who do you advise being involved in this type of support?
Yeah, so there are the kind of more obvious types of people like therapists and partners, if you have one, psychiatrists, if you are in some kind of group therapy, that can be helpful. But I find that people who ended up being part of my support system were people that I did not know were going to be such amazing support until they kind of came into my life. So I mentioned earlier this care calendar that we had, and it was really just because I couldn't have the same people with me all the time. My partner had to go to work and such, and so we had this care calendar where people could just sign up, and we basically spammed everyone I even vaguely knew to ask if they would be able to sit with me, and they could volunteer for different dates. And so I've mentioned my sister-in-law, who ended up being a huge support, but also people I only vaguely knew. One of my dearest friends now was somebody who volunteered to sign up for the care calendar. And he signed up for like weeks of like coming and sitting with me. And I didn't know him that well at that time. We were all kind of like, well, I guess he has a lot of spare time. But it turned out that he just was able to work from home, and he has the biggest heart. And it was because of going through that really tough period with this person for so much of that period that I learned that person was going to be a really amazing person to be a part of my support system. So I would say it's important to rely on people are going to be great supports, such as maybe a partner or a relative, but also sometimes the most amazing people in your support system are people you didn't realize were going to be that.
Let me just share with you, Esmé, a couple of comments, and then I'll go to the next question. One attendee says, "I'm so thankful for the work you are doing." Another says, "Thank you for making our stories visible." And then another question goes back to the topic of disclosing. They ask, what if you disclose and it turns out that a coworker or boss wasn't safe? How do you handle that?
Yeah, again, I think the workplace thing is really tricky. Honestly, I have not been in that situation, in part because in a lot of cases, I just didn't disclose, in part because I was really nervous about my coworkers and about my bosses at the time. There are times that I have disclosed, and those turned out fine and actually great, because those people were willing to give me accommodations that I really needed. But I feel like the most important thing about those kinds of disclosures, and like I've said this over and over again, but these are really tricky, is to kind of try to feel it out if you can in some way. If you know somebody else who is a friend, who is a coworker, and they might know a little bit more about your manager or your boss. Sometimes the grapevine can be really good about stuff like this, like whisper networks. You can find out through those sometimes if somebody is safe to disclose to or talk to about these things. But yeah, that would be what I would say about that.
Okay. This other question kind of is linked to what we're seeing in our society in terms of violence. So I'll read it. It says, I've been incredibly frustrated by the automatic and often immediate association of mass violent acts with mental health struggles. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, I mentioned this in my talk, like it's something that's very real, and it's very real. People like to associate, say, mass shootings with taking Zoloft or something like that, when we could talk about the anger issues of men who are often perpetrators of domestic violence when it comes to mass shootings. I don't necessarily have a solution to this, except that I think that the media is hopefully becoming more educated about these topics. And I do see actually guidelines that come out about things of this nature that are that give me hope. Guidelines for the Associated Press, guidelines for different kinds of media, because often this kind of information is coming out from the media, and they're the ones who are framing the acts of violence, and so yeah, I think often writing to different media groups, different newspapers, different TV stations about things that bother you about their coverage can be helpful. So, yeah.
So let me just let's see. Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I lost video, so I'll continue. Esmé, speaking of guidelines, I want to talk a little bit about public health agencies. So it's been long established, it's not new, that public health agencies should incorporate mental health promotion into chronic disease prevention efforts, and so that we can develop a more comprehensive mental health program for the nation. What are your thoughts on the role of public health in addressing the unmet need and often underutilized mental health services among U.S. vulnerable populations?
Oh yeah, like I think it was one of the slides earlier in the evening that I noticed that the Asian percentage was the lowest one in terms of people who seek treatment and help. And I remember when I went to the Chinatown Mental Health Clinic being so amazed when I entered, and there was the waiting room right there, and I saw just Chinese people. Like, I was like, there are Chinese people here. Like, I was just like, wow, this is like an amazing thing, because I had grown up, with my experience with my parents, and my experience just like knowing about the horrible things that my great aunt had gone through. And she had a very, very tragic life that led to her dying in an institution. I think that part of what was so amazing to me, though, and something that I took away from that, is that having spaces that are devoted to certain populations are incredibly useful. I knew, or I was pretty sure from just being in that waiting room for a little bit, that a lot of the people there did not speak English very well. And I think the resources of a place like that to be able to provide Cantonese speaking or Mandarin speaking, or different dialects for that particular mental health clinic was such an amazing thing to see, and an amazing resource. And when I think of public health and the things that we can do to encourage different populations that may not feel welcome in a white psychiatrist's office, if we can find the funding and find the resources for those kinds of spaces, I think that would be really wonderful.
We have one more question, and this is from the community, and I've saved it last because I think it's really great to close on. We all watch television, or we're in the, we used to go to the movie theater, and maybe movies are coming back, in the big screen. So this person asked, what are some pop culture works, movies, shows, podcasts that address mental illness faithfully with intelligence, insight, emotion, or even humor?
One that I was so I have one that comes immediately to mind, and it's a podcast, and it was started by a writer named Sandy Allen, and they came out with a book called A Kind of Miraculous Paradise, that is based on their uncle's old papers and diaries and journals and things. And he was diagnosed with what was called paranoid schizophrenia at that time. But the great thing I love about Mad Chat, and Sandy is a great advocate, mental health advocate, is that each episode is about a pop culture thing and how that relates to depictions of mental illness. And I am often asked to appear on podcasts and talk about mental health issues and mental illness. But what I really loved about being asked to go on Mad Chat was that I also got to talk about Dawson's Creek, which is something that I really loved as a teenager. And I got to talk about the depiction of mental illness in Dawson's Creek, and how it influenced me when I was a teenager and first being diagnosed with things, but also like what was wrong with it, what was interesting about it, what it got wrong, the few things that got right. So I highly recommend Mad Chat. It's a great podcast. And so that would be my recommendation. I think that in terms of television and movies, those tend to get it wrong more often than they get it right. And I talk about this in my book quite a bit. A Beautiful Mind, which won so many Oscars, is kind of a mess. There's a lot of difficult pop culture out there. So I tend to gravitate more towards the things that are more grassroots, that don't require these huge budgets, that don't require Hollywood to sign off on them. So yeah.
Great. This has been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And I just want to say thank you so much. And the questions, your reading from your book and sharing your insights, your experience, your knowledge, we really appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely. And I actually have a CSU Monterey Bay sweatshirt that has a sea otter on it. And my partner had suggested that I wear it, but I was like, I don't think that's like the most professional outfit to wear. And I don't know if I can find it either, but we have one.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. And what I wanted to say also to this last question is that they can go and look at your website. It's great. You have a lot of good information in there. And I also will recommend to read your book. It's a very good way of learning.
This is the UK edition I have right here. But yeah.
Learning about what it is to have a schizophrenia. And thank you so much for letting us know about your story and being such a big advocate for culture, language, and disability rights that we really need in our community right now. I know now we're going to go back to our dean and he's going to close and say thank you again.
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Hoffman.
Thank you. So Esmé, I want to, first of all, thank you for that outstanding discussion and presentation. I think you've raised the level of consciousness, many of the issues associated with mental health, not only schizophrenia, but the whole realm of mental health and how many people have this mythology about what mental health actually is. And the notion of how the media depicts folks with mental health issues is a very important key topic. So to your presentation again, I want to thank you to all the participants, to our students and to the professionals and the people, not only as I mentioned in California, but throughout the world. Thank you for participating in this. I invite each and every one of you to not only continue your work in this area, but check the website for the university about other programs. I want to go back and make sure that I acknowledge many of the sponsors that we had, because they make this all particularly possible. They were the Salinas Valley Memorial Healthcare, Doctors on Duty Medical Clinics, Natividad Medical Center, Dignity Health. And as you can see, they've been extremely helpful. I want to invite everyone that has an interest of either learning about our programs to contact us, to all of the panelists, to the planning committee, to the speakers, thank you. I invite everyone to keep looking. As you can see, we're planning other events. And with that, I wish you all well, and thank you very much for your participation in this conference. Good night, all.